Racism is a curse not because it insults a person, but because it poisons the soul of whoever believes in it and the society that allows it to survive. It is a quiet disease that disguises itself as culture, humor, tradition, or pride, while slowly destroying empathy, reason, and justice. Racism begins with a lie so simple that it feels believable. The lie that some humans are naturally superior to others. That a shade of skin, a shape of eyes, an accent, a surname, or a birthplace determines intelligence, morality, or worth. And once this lie is accepted, it spreads everywhere. It shapes laws, education, media, policing, borders, and even the way children are raised. History gives us brutal proof of this curse. Entire civilizations justified slavery by claiming certain races were less human. Men and women were chained, whipped, sold, separated from their children, all while priests, politicians, and scholars twisted religion and science to make cruelty look righteous. Racism did not just hurt the enslaved, it corrupted the enslavers. It trained them to look at suffering without flinching, to hear screams without guilt, to profit without shame. And that moral decay did not end when slavery ended. It transformed, it learned new language. It replaced chains with policies, whips with stereotypes, auctions with algorithms, and today racism still decides who is feared, who is believed, who is protected, and who is ignored. Consider a simple example. Two people commit the same mistake. One is called human and given a second chance. The other is labeled dangerous and punished harshly. Not because of evidence, but because of race. Consider a child in a classroom whose name is mocked, whose culture is treated as backward, whose history is erased. That child learns early that the world sees them as less, and this lesson shapes confidence, ambition, and mental health for decades. Racism also infects those who think they benefit from it. It traps them in constant fear of losing. Imagine superiority. It makes them defensive, angry, obsessed with control, unable to see individuals as individuals, only as threats or stereotypes. Racism tells them they're special without effort and powerful without merit, and this false pride rots character. It replaces humility with arrogance and curiosity with suspicion. This is why racism survives even when facts destroy it, because it is not a belief system rooted in logic, but an emotional addiction to dominance and comfort. Racism whispers that the world is simple, that blame is easy, that complex problems have a single enemy. And once people accept this lie, they stop thinking deeply, they stop questioning power, and they stop seeing shared humanity. This curse divides neighbors, nations, and even families. It turns difference into danger and diversity into fear, and every time racism is tolerated, excused, or minimized, it tightens its grip not just on its victims, but on the moral future of the entire society. In the modern world, racism rarely announces itself openly. It no longer always shouts slurs or wears uniforms. Instead, it whispers through systems, habits, and assumptions. It hides behind phrases like just joking, just culture, just facts, or just the way things are. But its impact is just as real. Consider how fear is distributed unevenly, how one person walking at night is seen as harmless while another is seen as a threat before they speak or act. Consider airports where some bodies are searched more often, streets where some drivers are stopped more often, courts where some defendants are believed less often, and news headlines where the race of suspect is mentioned only when it fits a stereotype. These are not accidents. They are patterns, and patterns reveal belief systems. Racism in everyday life is death by 1,000 cuts. It is the teacher who expects less from a student because of their background, the employer who hesitates over a name that sounds foreign, the landlord who suddenly says the apartment is no longer available, the doctor who dismisses pain because they unconsciously believe certain people exaggerate. None of these moments alone may seem catastrophic, but together they shape life outcomes, confidence, income, health, and even life expectancy. Racism also invades the mind of the person targeted. It forces them to constantly calculate how they're being perceived, to speak carefully, dress carefully, smile carefully, to shrink or overperform just to be treated. Normally, this constant vigilance drains energy and steals joy. Psychologists call this racial stress. But in human terms, it is simply exhaustion. The exhaustion of having to prove your humanity again and again. And yet society often demands politeness from the wounded and patience from the oppressed, telling them not to be angry, not to be sensitive, not to make things about race. This demand itself is racist, because it asks the harmed to protect the comfort of the comfortable. Silence is one of racism's greatest allies. Silence in classrooms when a stereotype is spoken. Silence in offices when bias shapes decisions. Silence at dinner tables when elders repeat harmful myths. Every moment of silence teaches the next generation what is acceptable. Racism also mutates online, where anonymity amplifies cruelty and algorithms reward outrage. Lies spread faster than truth, and dehumanization becomes entertainment. Memes replace empathy, and harassment becomes a game. But behind every screen is a real person absorbing that hatred, carrying it into their daily life, into their relationships, into their self-image. And still racism survives because it offers something seductive, a simple explanation for complex problems. It tells people that unemployment, crime, or social change is caused not by systems or inequality, but by some other group. This lie protects power and redirects anger downward instead of upward. History repeats this pattern again and again whenever societies face economic stress or cultural change. Racism resurfaces as a convenient scapegoat, and once accepted, it justifies cruelty in the name of order. This is why racism is not just a personal flaw, but a social curse. It distorts truth, rewards ignorance, and turns ordinary people into passive participants in injustice without ever forcing them to feel responsible. Racism does not only damage bodies and opportunities, it corrodes morality, faith, and the idea of justice itself. When a society accepts that some people matter less, every moral rule becomes flexible, compassion becomes selective, and cruelty becomes justified. This is how ordinary people come to participate in extraordinary injustice. History shows that the greatest evils were not carried out only by monsters, but by neighbors, clerks, teachers, and officials who convinced themselves they were simply following norms. Racism gives permission to conscience to sleep. It teaches people to stop asking hard questions about suffering as long as the suffering belongs to someone labeled other. Faith traditions across the world warn against this danger, because racism directly challenges the idea that human dignity is sacred. In Islam, the message is explicit. All humans come from a single soul, and diversity exists so that people may know one another, not despise one another. The Prophet Muhammad confronted racism directly when he declared that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab and no white person is superior to a black person except by character and righteousness. This was a radical statement in a tribal world, and it remains radical today because it removes every false measure of worth and replaces them with moral responsibility. Racism also weakens the future by teaching children distorted lessons about power. Children who are taught superiority learn entitlement without effort, while children taught inferiority learn doubt before they learn confidence. Both are robbed, one of humility and the other of self-belief. Consider two classrooms separated by invisible lines, one filled with resources and expectations, the other filled with suspicion and surveillance. The children did not choose this divide, but they will live with its consequences, and yet resistance has always existed. Courage appears wherever someone refuses to accept dehumanization as normal. It appears in the enslaved person who learns to read in secret, in the student who speaks up despite ridicule, in the worker who documents discrimination despite fear, in the bystander who says that's not okay when silence would be safer. These acts may seem small, but they fracture the spell racism depends on. Because racism needs agreement to survive, it needs people to nod along, laugh along, or look away. Every act of resistance reasserts a simple truth that humanity is not divisible, that dignity is not conditional, and that justice cannot belong to only one group without eventually collapsing for all. Racism promises order. but delivers decay. It claims to protect identity, but ends up hollowing it out, and it always demands more victims to justify its existence. This is why societies that cling to racism stagnate, while those that confront it, however imperfectly, move closer to their ideals. The fight against racism is not about replacing one hierarchy with another. It is about dismantling the lie that hierarchies based on birth are natural or necessary. It is about remembering that morality loses its meaning the moment it stops applying to everyone. When racism targets someone personally, it does more than insult. It invades the inner world. It forces a person to question how they are seen before they even speak. It turns ordinary moments into calculations of safety, tone, and appearance. A walk, a job interview, a classroom discussion, a police stop, all become charged with invisible tension. Imagine being told directly or indirectly that your presence is a problem, that you must constantly prove you belong. This pressure accumulates quietly. It shows up as anxiety, anger, fatigue, or numbness. And yet society often minimizes this pain, telling those targeted to toughen up, to ignore it, to not make everything about race. But trauma does not disappear because it is denied. It settles deeper, shaping self-image and trust. Some respond by shrinking, becoming quieter, smaller, less visible. Others respond by overperforming, trying to be flawless, so there is no excuse for mistreatment. Both responses are survival strategies, and neither should be confused with weakness. Racism also isolates. It makes people feel alone in their experience, doubting whether what happened was real or imagined. This gaslighting is powerful because it steals certainty, and without certainty, it becomes harder to resist. Reclaiming dignity begins with naming the harm, saying that was racist, that was wrong, not for the approval of the offender, but for the protection of the self. Boundaries become an act of self. Respect, not engaging, walking away, documenting, or speaking up are all valid responses depending on safety and context. There is no single heroic way to endure racism. Survival itself is resistance. Healing requires community, spaces where one does not have to explain or justify their pain, where identity is affirmed rather than questioned. Culture, language, faith, and history become sources of grounding. Reminders that one's existence is not an error, but part of a larger human story. Racism wants its targets to internalize shame, but shame belongs to the ideology, not the individual. Over time, confronting racism personally can either harden the heart or sharpen empathy. Many who have faced it develop a deep sensitivity to injustice of all kinds, becoming voices for fairness not just for themselves, but for others. This transformation is not automatic, and it is not owed to anyone. Pain does not obligate wisdom, but when healing is supported, suffering can produce clarity. The clarity that dignity is non-negotiable, that respect is not a favor, and that no system that requires humiliation to function deserves loyalty. In reclaiming dignity, people do not become less angry by pretending nothing happened. They become freer by refusing to carry lies about their worth. Racism does not survive only because of loud extremists. It survives because of ordinary moments where ordinary people choose comfort over conscience. And this is also where it can be dismantled, not always through grand speeches or viral movements, but through daily decisions that reset what is acceptable. Challenging racism begins internally, by questioning the assumptions absorbed from family, media, and history, noticing the first reaction of fear or judgment and asking where it came from, refusing to let stereotypes become shortcuts for thinking. This inner work is quiet and uncomfortable, but essential because unexamined bias leaks into behavior even when intentions are good. Externally challenging racism often looks small, a calm refusal to laugh at a racist joke, a simple question like, "What do you mean by that?" A clear statement that a comment is not okay. These moments disrupt social permission. They signal that prejudice is not harmless or normal in workplaces and schools. This resistance becomes structural, advocating for fair policies, transparent hiring, equal discipline, and inclusive education, not as favors but as rights. Allyship is not about speaking over those affected or seeking praise. It is about using one's position to reduce harm and amplify fairness. Sometimes it means stepping forward, sometimes stepping back, and sometimes staying when others walk away. Teaching children is one of the most powerful interventions. Children learn values not from slogans, but from what adults tolerate. Explaining difference honestly, correcting bias gently, and modeling respect shapes the next generation more than any law alone. Racism weakens when exposure increases. When people build real relationships across difference, when stories replace stereotypes and complexity replaces fear, this does not mean ignoring harm or pretending everyone is the same. It means refusing to reduce people to a single trait. Progress is often slow and uneven, and mistakes are inevitable. But growth depends on accountability rather than denial, apologizing without defensiveness, learning without centering ego, and accepting discomfort as part of moral development. Silence feels peaceful, but it is not neutral. Every unchallenged injustice teaches a lesson, either that dignity matters or that it is negotiable. Daily resistance may not feel heroic, but history is shaped by these accumulations, by people who quietly refused to cooperate with lies, who chose empathy over convenience, and who understood that justice is not an abstract ideal, but a practice repeated until it becomes culture. The curse of racism is not inevitable, but it is persistent. It survives wherever lies about human worth are left unchallenged and where indifference is mistaken for peace. Ending it requires courage, awareness, and sustained action. It requires acknowledging the harm done, not only to victims, but to society as a whole, because a world that devalues some humans degrades the moral and emotional capacity of all humans. Imagine a society where children grow up believing they're defined by skin, language, or heritage rather than character and effort. A society where fear dictates who is hired, who is policed, who is educated, and who is ignored. This is a society that has already accepted decay, but the opposite is also true. Every act of resistance, every conversation, every refusal to accept cruelty as normal, every lesson taught to a child about fairness and dignity, every policy implemented to ensure equality slowly unravels the curse. Change is cumulative. It does not require perfection. It requires persistence, personal reflection combined with public courage, safety combined with moral clarity. The fight against racism is not abstract. It is daily, lived, practiced in how we speak, how we think, how we react, and how we teach, hire, comfort, and confront. The individual who stands firm in the face of prejudice, the bystander who speaks out, the parent who teaches compassion, the teacher who expects excellence from all students, all are part of the chain that breaks the curse. And as the curse weakens, society itself becomes freer, richer in empathy, stronger in justice, and more resilient to fear and hatred. The world remembers those who act, not those who stayed silent. And in the end, racism is defeated not by anger alone, but by clarity, dignity, and consistent action. It is defeated when humans remember that no one's life is less valuable, no identity less worthy, that diversity is not danger but strength, and that freedom and justice are indivisible. Because the curse of racism can only survive when humans believe lies about each other. And it dies when we choose truth, compassion, and courage again and again, every day, in every encounter, until fairness becomes habit and humanity becomes the only measure of worth. The curse of racism can be broken, but it begins with us, in the way we see, the way we speak, and the way we act. Racism is not a single moment of cruelty. It is a network of habits, structures, and assumptions that reinforce themselves over decades and centuries. Consider the housing policies that once explicitly denied ownership to people of certain races, redlining maps drawn by banks that labeled entire neighborhoods as undesirable, a decision that echoes through generations in wealth, education, and opportunity. Consider neighborhoods where schools are underfunded, where playgrounds are unsafe, where libraries are empty because the zip code was defined by skin color decades ago, children who never meet a teacher who looks like them, students who never see themselves reflected in history. Lessons accept as outsiders or victims. The emotional and cognitive toll of such invisibility is profound, yet often invisible to those who benefit from privilege. In employment, consider two equally qualified applicants, one with a name associated with whiteness, the other with a name associated with a minority group. Studies show the first is far more likely to get an interview. And the difference is not skill, but perception, bias, and expectation. In healthcare, patients are marginalized. Groups experience longer waits, less attention, misdiagnosis, and dismissive treatment, resulting in measurable disparities in life expectancy. And these patterns are multiplied across law enforcement, media representation, political power, and social mobility. Racism is systemic, but it is also intimate. It shows up in classrooms, workplaces, streets, social media, and even families. A parent repeating an old stereotype, a colleague joking about accents, a driver clutching the wheel as a pedestrian passes, small moments that individually may seem trivial, but collectively reinforce a narrative of inferiority. And the human mind absorbs these messages constantly, teaching self-doubt, hypervigilance, and fear. This is why resilience in the face of racism is not simply emotional toughness. It is the ongoing act of resisting a society that constantly signals that you are less. Survival becomes a skill, dignity becomes a practice, and everyday courage is required. Examples of courage abound from civil rights leaders who marched knowing they would be beaten, jailed, or worse, to students who refuse to be separated in classrooms, to whistleblowers exposing discrimination at work, to ordinary citizens who refuse to participate in jokes, policies, or behaviors that demean. These acts may appear small to outsiders, but they are cumulative. They break the spell racism relies on. Every correction, every refusal, every affirmation of humanity chips away at centuries of accepted lies. Even online, speaking truth to misinformation, defending someone harassed, correcting a stereotype, is an act of resistance. Racism is like a forest fire that feeds on dry leaves of inattention, silence, and apathy, and it dies when enough people water the ground with awareness, compassion, and courage. The curse of racism is long, painful, and complex, but history shows it can be weakened, slowed, and ultimately broken, not overnight, not perfectly, but persistently, through reflection, conversation, action, and moral consistency. Because the power of racism exists only when humans accept its lies about each other. Racism does not wait for grand occasions to strike. It appears in the most mundane and ordinary moments. The glance that lingers suspiciously, the question phrased with hidden judgment, the opportunity quietly withheld, the stereotype casually repeated in conversation. A teacher assuming a student cannot excel because of their background. A manager deciding whose ideas matter without realizing why. A friend laughing at a joke that belittles an entire community. These small acts may seem insignificant individually, but their accumulation shapes lives, communities, and futures. Consider a young professional entering the workforce, full of ambition and talent, but repeatedly overlooked for promotions, subtle remarks about how they fit with the company culture, colleagues unconsciously favoring others, each incident eroding confidence, producing stress, and forcing them to prove themselves constantly. Or think of a student in school whose contributions are ignored, whose questions are dismissed, whose creativity is undervalued because teachers or peers have unconsciously absorbed societal prejudices. The effect is not just emotional. It manifests in educational outcomes, career paths, mental health, and self-perception. Yet even in these moments, resistance is possible. Speaking up, documenting patterns, supporting the affected person, educating oneself and others, refusing to participate in harm. These are practical ways to fight back, and they are cumulative, small acts that ripple outward, challenging the unspoken rules of bias and assumption. Historical examples illuminate the same truth. Activists and ordinary citizens alike have repeatedly demonstrated that change begins with noticing injustice, refusing to normalize cruelty, and taking action. Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus was a simple act of personal dignity, yet it catalyzed a movement. In South Africa, ordinary citizens defied apartheid daily in classrooms, workplaces, and streets, creating cracks in the system that eventually widened into collapse. These examples show that moral courage can exist at every level, and that no single act is too small. Personal experiences of confronting racism, whether through dialogue, protest, or private assertion of dignity, are threads in a larger tapestry of change. This is why education, empathy, and awareness are critical, because the curse of racism thrives on ignorance and fear and is weakened by knowledge, understanding, and human connection. Confronting racism personally also requires self-care, because exhaustion and trauma are real. Healing, reflection, and community are essential to sustain resistance. Dignity cannot survive in isolation, and support networks, allies, and cultural grounding are vital. The curse of racism is powerful because it attacks both body and spirit. But persistence, courage, and daily moral choices gradually erode its power. Every refusal to participate in prejudice, every affirmation of equality, every effort to see another person fully chips away at centuries of harm and slowly transforms culture, institutions, and consciousness. Ultimately, the fight against racism is not abstract or symbolic. It is lived, practiced, repeated, and reinforced every day in countless small, brave, and meaningful actions that collectively reclaim justice, humanity, and moral integrity. Racism reaches beyond a single moment or generation. It reverberates across families, communities, and history. The harm is intergenerational. Children inherit not only the wealth and opportunities of their parents, but also the stress, limitations, and exclusions imposed by racism. Consider families who were systematically denied property, education, or fair wages for decades. Each generation begins life a step behind, navigating barriers they did not create. Or think of communities repeatedly subjected to discriminatory policing, biased healthcare, or underfunded schools. The emotional and social toll accumulates, shaping expectations, resilience, and mental health. Yet in the same families and communities, resilience blossoms in extraordinary ways. Grandparents teaching courage and pride, parents modeling perseverance, elders telling stories of survival and resistance. Young people learning from these examples to challenge injustice in their own lives. Globally, we see this pattern repeated, from the civil rights struggles in the United States to anti-apartheid movements in South Africa, from indigenous rights movements in Australia to anti-caste activism in South Asia. Ordinary people confronted systemic inequality with persistence, documentation, storytelling, and courage, each act a beacon for others. The personal and the political are intertwined. The fight against racism is fought in daily acts of dignity, in classrooms, workplaces, streets, courts, and homes. Confronting stereotypes in conversation, calling out injustice online, mentoring those marginalized, teaching children to value difference, challenging policies that perpetuate inequity. These small, cumulative acts undermine the structures that racism depends on. Every refusal to accept the lie that one group is superior chips away at centuries of oppression. Personal resilience and social action are linked. When individuals reclaim dignity and refuse to internalize demeaning messages, they model a world where difference is not threat. Every story shared, every truth told, every history remembered prevents the normalization of prejudice. And in this way, resistance becomes part of culture itself. The curse of racism thrives on silence, invisibility, and inaction, but every voice raised against it, every hand extended in solidarity, every principle upheld strengthens the human capacity for fairness, justice, and empathy. And though the work is long, exhausting, and ongoing, the accumulation of small acts, sustained over time, proves that transformation is possible. The personal experiences of pain, endurance, and triumph become lessons for society, teaching future generations that human dignity cannot be bought, bargained, or diminished by birth, color, or origin. That equality is not an abstract concept, but a daily practice of recognition, respect, and courage. In today's world, racism often wears subtle faces, hidden in policies, language, and algorithms. It manifests as microaggressions, those small, often unconscious comments or behaviors that belittle, stereotype, or exclude. A teacher repeatedly mispronouncing a student's name while expecting perfection, a colleague complimenting someone for speaking well when it would never occur to them to say it to a white coworker, a news article highlighting a crime differently depending on the suspects. Race, these microaggressions accumulate over time, shaping confidence, self-perception, and trust in society. Online, bias spreads at a different scale. Algorithms amplify content that triggers outrage. Dehumanization is gamified. Harassment and stereotyping are rewarded with attention. And misinformation about racial or ethnic groups spreads faster than truth. Yet online spaces also offer tools for resistance. Individuals documenting patterns, speaking truth, sharing stories, creating communities of support. These acts challenge the narrative and educate others. Institutional racism continues to affect education, healthcare, employment, housing, and policing. Laws may prohibit overt discrimination, but structural barriers persist. Resource allocation, zoning, hiring networks, promotion criteria, disciplinary practices all carry hidden biases that reinforce inequity. Practical resistance involves awareness, vigilance, and deliberate action. Noticing unequal treatment, calling it out, mentoring and supporting those affected, advocating for fair policies, engaging with media critically, refusing to normalize casual prejudice in everyday life. Combating racism requires attention to language, exposure, and relationships, building genuine connections across difference, questioning assumptions, teaching children to value fairness and diversity, speaking out when injustice occurs, and modeling dignity, self-respect, and empathy. Every small choice contributes to a larger cultural shift. Every intervention, no matter how minor it seems, reduces the space where prejudice can thrive. Collective impact grows as individual awareness multiplies. The curse of racism is not mystical. It is human-made, and human action, persistence, and moral courage can dismantle it. The responsibility falls on each person to confront bias within themselves and in the world around them. And while the work is ongoing, incremental victories, affirming dignity, challenging injustice, uplifting marginalized voices, accumulate over time, proving that persistent moral action can break centuries of harm. Racism only survives when ignored, tolerated, or justified, and dies when humans consistently choose truth, justice, and recognition of shared humanity. Racism is a curse, not only because it harms those it targets, but because it corrodes the hearts, minds, and futures of everyone in its path. It is a lie told over centuries that some humans are worth less, and that difference is danger, and it survives through silence, apathy, and inaction. But the truth is unbreakable. Human dignity is inherent, equality is non-negotiable, and compassion is the only moral compass that sustains society. History teaches us that courage can dismantle even the most entrenched systems of hate, from those who walked miles in defiance of segregation to those who quietly taught children to value every identity. Resistance is not only about heroic moments, but about daily moral choices, noticing injustice, speaking truth, refusing to participate in cruelty, supporting the oppressed, and nurturing empathy. It is in every classroom where teachers challenge bias, in every workplace where fairness is demanded, in every family where children are taught to see humanity in difference, in every digital space where misinformation and stereotyping are corrected. Every action chips away at the curse. Racism survives only when humans accept lies about each other, and it dies when humans embrace truth, courage, and empathy consistently. The fight against racism is long, complex, and ongoing, but it is not hopeless because every story of resistance, every affirmation of dignity, Every correction of injustice and every act of moral courage proves that change is possible. It is a responsibility shared by all, across generations, cultures, and nations. The curse of racism can be broken, but it begins with us in the way we see others, the way we speak, and the way we act. And the more we choose justice, empathy, and recognition of shared humanity, the closer we come to a world where equality is lived, diversity is celebrated, and no human is made to feel less than they are. The curse of racism can end, one courageous choice at a time, until fairness, dignity, and humanity become the natural state of society.